Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Jeremy Schweitzer, and I'm talking today about designing for designing for inclusion and equity using AI to create learning for everyone. So I do want to get started a little bit asking about my audience that I have here with me in person. How many of you have used AI to develop training content or help you developing training content? So not everybody, but a little bit. How many of you have used it specifically to look at accessibility or inclusion already? Anyone? A little bit, but a little bit less. Okay, that's great. Just gives me a benchmark about kind of who's here, who's my audience. So this is just real quick about me. So I am a senior product manager at OpenLMS. We are a learning management systems company. What does this senior product manager do? I basically set the roadmap for our corporate product lines. So anything where government, continuing education, companies, associations, that's kind of what I do. But I started my career as an instructional designer and a classroom trainer, originally starting training social workers, and I did that for many, many, many years before I started moving into product development. So I've been in this industry for about 20 years. So I have some objectives, because that's still something that's deeply burned into me that we're going to talk about a little bit. You can all read them, but really the idea is about how you can use AI in the creation of personalized learning experiences, also how you can use those tools to improve the accessibility of your work product, how you can use AI to detect bias and potential bias in some of the content you have. This one's also really great for reviewing legacy content, something that is time consuming to do manually, so it can really help you speed up that process. And also just talk about how you can use AI in content creation and as a tool to just help you make better content faster. So I always like this quote. I've actually been using it for a couple of different presentations lately. The future belongs to those who learn more skills and combine them in creative ways. AI is just another tool in our toolbox. Figuring out where and how best to use it is going to be the differentiator between superstars in different organizations and those that are just kind of following along. So first I want to talk about what is the concept of disability. Because that can be defined in a lot of different ways and means different things to different audiences. So there's kind of three main models that I'm at least going to talk about today. There's others, but these are kind of the most common models. The medical model, the social model, and the biophysiosocial model, which I always struggle to say, and I still think I butchered. The medical model is really seen as where you're talking about a pathological impairment to the body, and you talk about symptoms and causes in very clinical ways. So thinking about partial lesions at T4 or left hemiplegia. So it's very specialized with language that is not shared in common with a lot of people. And it really focuses on how do you move someone towards a ideal normal. The social model is kind of defined about political and social theory that really looks at disability and as a result of societal barriers, not necessarily the physical kind of manifestation. And then the biophysiosocial model is really about thinking about things holistically and treating people on both the biological, psychological, and social factors so that someone can lead a fulfilling and active life. We often see when disability is featured in the movies, TV shows, storylines, the medical model, and it is often used as a disabled character being portrayed as depressed or isolated or limited, and through their story they teach a lesson to able-bodied people. So that is the most common model that we see in a lot of at least US and Western media, but it's not a very good story or a very expansive story about what disability means and looks like. I also want to talk about how many people are disabled in some way. So it's estimated that 16% of individuals live with a disability. That's over 1.3 billion people, and I always read this one to make sure I don't mess it up, but 1.3 billion seconds is basically 32 years from now. So think about how big that number really is. It's also suspected that this is actually a gross underestimation of disability. And that's partially because there are so many invisible disabilities. Many, up to 90% of disabilities are invisible to the people that are interacting with that person on a regular basis. This can be both mental disability, so something like severe depression, clinical depression, severe anxiety. It could also be things that are physical, that they're just treated in such a way that they aren't obvious to you. So that could be someone that actually has a prosthetic leg. But if you only ever seen them in long pants, you might not know that they have that disability. It can also be other things that just, they have a mild version of it and it's just not immediately evident that that is a disability, but it's still something that impacts them and their ability to function in at least some contexts. One of the ways that we like to think about and talk about this when we're talking about making content accessible and making it inclusive is the extra energy and time someone with a disability has to put into achieving the same outcome. If we could have more accessible content, more inclusive spaces, they could redirect that energy, that time, into being productive and creating maybe amazing new things or being a more productive coworker alongside you. So what does making things actually accessible look like? What does that mean? So accessibility means that a person with a disability is afforded the same opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same activities, and doing so in an environment that is as equally integrated and substantially similar as a non-disabled person. And you did see me looking over my shoulder to get it right, because I always like to get this one correct. That means something different for every different disability. So one of the things that I sometimes, when I'm talking to, especially a smaller group where we're talking about how to deploy this in a very operational way. For example, even this, when I normally give it to a large group, is an hour-long presentation that we cut down for today. But I've done whole sessions where we've spent 8 hours talking about a specific project, really breaking it down in detail. One thing a group that hasn't really worked on this before will sometimes say to me, well, there's no way we can make it perfectly accessible, so why are we even spending the time on this? Improving it for as many people as you can reasonably do is still forward progress and is a constantly iterative process, also driven by the fact that technology is constantly changing. So why is it important? I've been talking about it a little bit, but it just allows your coworkers, your customers, anyone that you're developing content training for can just access that better, easier, they'll get more out of it, and it'll have long-term better outcomes for everyone. So the other thing that I think also comes up a lot is accessibility is a lot like traffic laws. Everyone knows that they're supposed to be doing this, but we don't always follow the rules. And it's actually one of those spots where we think AI and AI tools can really help streamline this and make it so easy to at least do basic accessibility changes and inclusiveness changes that it's a lot easier. It becomes more of a default rather than something that you think about late in the development of a project. So, inclusive learning and development. So what does that really mean? It means thinking about the learning, the skills, and that you're putting together for all of your employees to promote diversity and acceptance of those different types of diversity. So it has a lot of benefits, not only for the users with disabilities that you're attempting to work with, it has benefits for able-bodied and able people as well. Because you might be someone that prefers to read everything written out on a page. Or you might be someone that really prefers to listen to content in an audio format. These are truly our preferences. They often don't have a significant impact in most studies on what you actually get out of the content. but being able to consume content in your preferred modality makes it more likely that you will actually complete a course, actually consume the content. So thinking through and making content that can work for people that have disabilities that they might not be able to read, or they might not be able to listen to it, so that there's content in all those ways, immediately makes it more useful to users that have a particular preference. It also gets us to really start thinking about how we're building and putting together content and making it just easier to use for everyone. And so those are some of the benefits that just are available to everyone that is interacting with more inclusive and more accessible content. It also just helps that you bring more people to the party, you get more perspectives, and you engage in those perspectives, and it helps drive new ideas or better ideas. It just keeps you from ending up accidentally talking to an echo chamber. There's also some legal pieces. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I like to point it out. There is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That is an international treaty that sets a framework for how you are supposed to treat people with disabilities and accommodate them. And most nations have some kind of legal framework. And because we are an international audience, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth for those. But the US has multiple different frameworks depending on the specific type of disability. The UK and most other countries do as well. But together, those create mandates and legal obligations to most organizations to at least have considered accessibility as part of the content that you put out. So when we're really thinking about inclusiveness, which is part of the disability that I'm talking about, we're also thinking about equal access and opportunity regardless of the barriers someone might have or the audience that you're attempting to reach out to. I happen to work for an international company. We have offices in multiple countries around the world. Not all of them are native English-speaking countries. Not all of them conduct the majority of their business in English. In fact, many of them conduct the majority of their business in a different language. I happen to be someone who only speaks English, but I need to be able to communicate information to audiences that don't speak English as their native language or maybe have limited English skills. So I need to be able to provide content in those other languages. So that's just one example, and I'll actually talk about how you can use tools and why you might use tools to AI tools to be able to drive that process when you're talking about different languages. You can also use AI tools when you're thinking about inclusiveness and disability to think about not just your content, but also your teaching and assessment strategies. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then also whether there is bias or accessibility barriers in your assessment processes. So I've already kind of been talking about this, but AI fits in a lot of different parts of the application of creating a program, rolling a program out, also just thinking about how you advertise that you have a new program or have new content. So AI can help you with content curation. It can help you with adding things like chatbots to be able to provide just-in-time supports inside of your content. It can also do things depending on the platforms that you're using for personalized learning paths. So someone can say to a chatbot potentially, hey, I'm trying to learn about this, and it can suggest learning, or hey, I'm struggling with this concept. Do you have content in a different modality that can maybe help me consume it in a different way? It can help with the creation of adaptive assessments. It can also do, I have it listed as NLP feedback here, so natural language processing feedback. It can help you via those models to be able to assess, do you have hidden bias or hidden barriers inside of your content? So lots of just different ways that you can use AI tools. So things that I've written with the help of ChatGPT. I'm going to use that one as my example most of the time because it's the one that I've used the most, but these can be used with many other models that other companies also have. So I've created training outlines. We already have the training. We plug it in and say, give me an outline of this. So you can also start to see like, oh, we skipped over something with the outline that it popped out. Or is it bad? Like, is this a bad outline? But sometimes you're like, oh no, we skipped a whole thing somehow. We missed that. Client emails. I've definitely, when I'm like writing an email, especially if it's like one of those, like I have some maybe not great news to give to a client, I might ask ChatGPT or something else to rewrite it for me to be like, okay, take the emotion out of that, or help me rephrase this, or translate it into another language for me. If I'm sending it to a client, I'll still do the last step that I'll talk about later when I'm talking about this, but translating it into another language is one of those great tools that ChatGPT has actually gotten really good at some languages. Not every language, but some languages. In my experience so far, Spanish and French it's gotten quite good at, and it's also functional when it comes to German, but I use it during development phases, but I still typically have someone double check it before we ever push it out in a like production release or something I actually send to a customer. I have used it to translate customers' emails to me though, to try and make sure I'm understanding things. I've used it to reword content that we've created already for another use, to update content. So if I know that something has changed relatively recently, I might say, hey, can you update this with the most recent version of some policy or procedure that I know it might have access to, and it can help just quickly speed up update processes. And also, like I've been talking about, translations, I called out specifically for training content here, but I've also given a few of the other examples of how I use it. And then also for the title and description for, I also said webinar, but this presentation. I'm also going to quickly touch on a couple other tools that are just examples of the way AI is showing up in other products and helping you do different things. So Word Online has the ability to help you quickly create transcripts. And one of the things I like about its specific version is it will recognize different speakers. You can see over in the side, speaker 1, speaker 2, back and forth, and it'll give you both timestamps of when they started and stopped talking and give you a transcript of the conversation. So if you have an O365 account, which lots of people do either through their employer or their school, this is something that you can quickly use to get transcripts of content and time-stamped breakouts of your speakers, which can be really useful when creating subtitles or summaries or any of those types of things out of a meeting or an interview or something like that. Great for working with a subject matter expert, quickly getting down and not having to create all of your notes manually, and then you can take that transcript and start editing it with other tools. Also, one thing that I used to struggle with, and I've been doing it long enough, I feel like I'm pretty good at it now and I don't often use a different tool, but one of the pieces of feedback I've gotten from people more than once is, how do I write a alt description for an image? Like, that's hard. And in some cases, they're not wrong. It's hard to do and do it well. So this is a free app from Microsoft. I believe it's iOS only, so I don't think it's available for Android, or it wasn't the last time I looked. But it'll actually let you take a picture of something and it'll give you suggested alt text for that. So if you're struggling doing that, this is a great tool for quickly speeding up that process. And then ChatGPT. This is the example I'm going to use for talking about the translation. But one of the things that I've really started to do is, one of my regular pieces of content that I write and release are release notes. I write them in English because that's the language that I know the best and I'm most comfortable with, but we want to be able to publish those in multiple languages. So one of the things I've really started doing is publishing them, writing them up in English, and then having ChatGPT translate them. So then when I hand them to a staff member that is native to that country, they're not starting from zero. All they're having to do is fix any translation errors. So it has sped up their process dramatically, and I'm being less of a burden on them needing to provide a service to make our content inclusive. So that's one really useful way that I've actively used this. Back when I was an instructional designer, we often needed to translate our content into multiple languages. And I was doing this 20 years ago. There was no AI translation tools at the time. So what we often ended up doing is translation was the last step in our development process. So once the content was built, approved, then we would translate it. The downside of that is we always did all of our beta testing and our user testing in English only. That works fine if that's the majority of your audience, but there were times when there was content we were releasing that the primary audience wasn't English speaking. And one really cool thing that would have been awesome to do all the time, and I've actually have a couple of friends that are still IDs who are doing this now, they're using ChatGPT or similar tools to do quick translations during the development phase, and they're doing user testing in other languages early on. They're not using this still for production releases, but they're using it for those early beta versions so that they get feedback from a broader audience early on. And one of the things that it's really helped them catch is that there are cultural nuances in some of these topics that they weren't catching and their translations weren't adequately addressing, but they were able to adapt the content because they got the feedback earlier so that it was better in the final outcome. So it's just a great way of quickly and inexpensively expanding your user testing base to more languages if that's something that you as an organization does. So the kind of last pillar of what I'm going to be talking about today is detecting and mitigating bias and different types of bias in your content, which again is something that AI tools actually can be really useful with. So one of those is the natural language processing. So this is really what most of what we talk about AI tools are really doing. What they're really doing is they're breaking the content down into tokens and then processing those using natural language models. And everyone has their own version. ChatGPT is a great example of one that you have access to multiple models that you can switch between, and different models are beneficial for different types of work. So these AI tools can analyze your content and help identify where there is bias in the language, stereotypical content. They can also help you identify, if you ask it to, gender, racial, or cultural biases, and also help you identify language that might be inadvertently marginalizing specific groups. What I really like this kind of work for is bulk review of legacy content, because otherwise someone has to go to all this content that's already built and invested in and manually go through it and flag, is that bad enough that we need to take action for it? Whereas if you could just say, hey, here's all that legacy content, identify the problem areas, it lets you spend a lot less time just reviewing the content and a lot more time then taking action on deciding, hey, we're gonna just sunset this whole thing because we found really big problems in this one. Or these, hey, if we just do a bulk update of these 3 words throughout this entire thing, it's a lot better for more of our audience. So it really helps you narrow in and take strategic action on some of your content. One of the other things that it actually is pretty good at is helping do algorithmic fairness review, so it can actually look for bias in assessment. I will say, depending on the type of assessments you have in your platform or in your content, this one I find has a bigger potential impact in things like higher ed or intensive training programs. So training programs where there is a large degree of content creation that is manually reviewed, then these are the types of kind of interventions that I like people to think about and look at doing. So what you can basically do is start to pull in various examples of what someone submitted and what the assessor assessed it as, and then tell the system to review, is there a certain bias or problem that it is noticing? The one thing that I will say that it doesn't always do great is it will often be able to find there is a problem here, but it might not be able to tell you why the problem is happening. So often in this kind of review, you're gonna have to look at it and see, can we tell why it's happening? Can we figure out what is the root cause of this particular imbalance? Often where you'll see it show up are outcomes that are not working well for particular groups. And higher ed is an example, and I still work with several universities. We will see students that are on lower socioeconomic levels perform worse, despite other indicators saying they should be equal or outperforming some students. And one of the really common issues that we find is that student is working 2 jobs and they're just too tired. They're not getting enough sleep, and it's negatively impacting their ability to test. There's not always a good way of fixing that. but it's useful to understand why it might be happening and if there are interventions that you can do. So one of the things that can come up sometimes is if you're an instructor or you have a program that everyone has to test at the same time, providing multiple times that someone can test, because you might be able to adjust for that. We also notice it in programs like nursing programs. So if you have certain times where people are supposed to get tests or have access to testing facilities, if a nurse is coming off a 12-hour shift and has to do the test at the end of that shift, that nurse doesn't perform as well. Well, you need to be able to provide adjustments to be able to do those at different times when they can have more optimum performance. So those are some of the types of things where it's not always clear how to fix it, but you can at least see that you're having a particular problem. The nursing one's an actual real example. They couldn't figure out, they had a particular cohort that kept performing badly, and they're like, why? And they realized it was the nurses that always took a night shift, because they always had to do their exam after a shift. It was just one of those random, they couldn't figure out why, because they were like, they are otherwise good nurses. What's happening? Well, that was what it was. As soon as they fixed that, made more times where they could test, the problem disappeared. You can also use it to do assessments of biases in instructor and learner interactions. This is, again, one of those examples that I see it most used in higher ed, but also used in cohort training or mentor-mentee kind of training environments where you have a lot of content documented of the interaction. So like someone does a thing, they get a review, they ask a question, you have a lot of that interaction data. Typically you need at minimum of 12 interaction data points to be able to see any data. So if any of your kind of interactions are less than that, you're unlikely to see any noticeable trends. But if you have like a 3-month program where someone's working one-on-one with a mentor for 3 months, you'll usually have enough data that you can start to assess, are we having a problem with particular instructors? The thing that people always get worried about this one is we're going to fire someone that is biased against this group of people, or we're going to give them a bad review for it. That's not typically what I'm advocating for, not typically what I find people doing this work are advocating for. What they're saying is that's probably an unconscious bias that that person has, that they're not even realizing they're doing it. So if you can identify that that's happening and have a conversation with the person, most people want to do better, especially someone that's a trainer or a mentor. They want to be doing that. They don't realize that they have a particular bias or something that's happening that's causing them to not be as generous or as supportive to a particular subset of the users they're working with. So pointing that out, working with that person can often solve that, and that's all that's necessary. I think okay, and that's it. And that's pretty good timing. So, so if people have any questions or want to have a follow-up conversation, I will be at booth 326. It's basically straight down this way. This one, yeah. There's no numbers this year for the rows, so can't answer that well. Or I guess it is right there. It's aisle 300. You can also check out our free resources. I'll also just jump over real quick to this QR code that'll actually take you to the URL that was on the last one, which is sometimes more helpful. So I'll leave that up there as we wrap up. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk to you after we're done. So thanks, everyone.